The Western world faces a profound crisis. The crisis is not just political, economic, or social, nor even a combination of them all. It is a fundamental crisis of efficacy, the ability of a nation-state to deliver for its people. In its wake comes growing disillusionment and dismay. In this country, the electorate has voted for fundamental change twice in recent years. First, at the Brexit referendum in 2016, and then again at the general election in 2019. But this popular appetite has only been partially sated, fuels frustration and feeds fury. To understand why, we must appreciate the widening chasm between the people of Britain and the elite who profess to serve them. The very same elitists who neither saw what was coming in 2016 and 19, nor could comprehend the results once they arrived. Why is it that every time the public demands change, the Liberal establishment initially claim they will listen and then go on in much the same way as they always have? At times, it's almost as if reality of itself had been bifurcated, that what the Liberal establishment envisage and what the people actually experience become entirely different, separate things. A dialectic as chilling as anything envisioned by Marx has come to pass, for the chasm between the assumptions of those with power and the sentiments of those who their power affects could scarcely be greater. Now, you know, as I do, that the solution is to be found in conservatism, but not in the desiccated, hollowed-out, sugar-free conservatism deemed to be just about acceptable by our liberal masters. Too many conservatives opt out of the conflict, instead seeking the approval of the very establishment which wants to grind them into the dust. No, we must look to a genuine, authentic, time-honoured, true conservatism, free from the lonely individualism and selfish materialism of liberalism. This conservatism was part of the political mainstream as recently as the mid-20th century. Yet since, it has been either neglected or misunderstood by politicians both on the left and the right. And by the way, misunderstood too by much of the academic world. Such is the failure to grasp the essence of our credo, the heart of what Burke understood, what Disraeli evangelized, and what Michael Oakeshott and Roger Scruton explained, that when prompted by the question, why are you a conservative, many relatively sensible, the emphasis there is on relatively, sensible people would simplistically reply, it's because the Conservative Party is the party of freedom. Of course, the Conservative Party, through its long history, has defended our fraternal interests, protected human dignity, and elevated the people. For ours is the party of Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery, who fought despite the agonised bleats of the free market liberals. The party of Shaftesbury, who began the ragged schools and freed children from factories. The party of Disraeli, who gave working men the vote. The party of Margaret Thatcher, who unlocked opportunity to champion aspiration. Yet conservatism by nature does not elevate one value above all others, or elevate abstract ideas above the concrete interests of families, communities, and the nation. For conservatism recognises the boundaries between common sense and doctrine, between personal freedom and shared obligations, between cold liberal rationalism and the sublime beauty of creation's eclecticism. The unthinking embrace of the idea that every supposed extension of individual interest, often described as rights, represents human progress, is largely responsible for the growing malaise eating away at our institutions. This malaise is preventing government from delivering the very changes which would reignite political engagement. While the public crave policies to protect the family, strengthen communities, and protect our borders, to unite our people, our liberal institutions often appear by an agenda which is the very opposite of all of that. The late philosopher, my friend Roger Scruton, coined a word for the force that drives so much of modern thinking: oikophobia, derived from the Greek for home, meaning a rejection both of the family of one's native culture. Oikophobe, Scruton said, quote, repudiates national loyalties and defines his goals and ideals against the nation, promoting transnational institutions over national governments, defining his political vision in terms of cosmopolitan values that have been purified of all reference to the particular attachments of a real historical community. This view of the world was institutionalised in Britain during Tony Blair's disastrous decade in government. Blair's understanding of the government was essentially an extension of the long-established Whig view, though with an unwholesome emphasis on the growing role of supranational institutions. According to that Whig view, constitutional evolution is a process by which the exercise of authority is perpetually progressive, so that constant change is both necessary and desirable. As the political descendants of the Whigs lost faith in Parliament in the late 1960s, they turned to non-elected institutions, such as the courts, to uphold their liberal values. Blair exaggerated and accelerated this dismantling of a good deal of our long-standing constitutional settlement. The process of European integration, following the Maastricht Treaty and the creation of the European Union, raised questions about the power and authority of national governments. According to the then fashionable theory of multi-level governance, actors at different levels would increasingly interact across national borders, making the boundaries between domestic and international politics redundant. Blair's cosmopolitan Whig view of the world justified a complete constitutional overhaul. Power was to be decentralised both to devolved governments in Scotland and Wales and to new regional assemblies in England. The European Convention of Human Rights was incorporated into domestic law, extending the authority of a foreign court over our legal system. And the process of EU integration was to be embraced. Though ingrained public opinion meant that Blair's constitutional revolution was thankfully never completely realised, we avoided regional government and the dreaded euro, his legacy fundamentally changed the way Britain is governed. The incorporation of the European Convention into domestic law has resulted in an unprecedented explosion in the number of cases brought under human rights law. According to one study, the percentage of cases heard by the law lords that could be classified as human rights cases rose from 2% in 1997 to 31% just 10 years later. The increasingly political nature of the cases heard by the courts helped spur Blair and his longtime friend Lord Falconer to bring forward plans to detach the judiciary from the other two branches of government. Ironically, rather than affirming the separation of powers, this compromised it, ending the historic role of the Lord Chancellor and the removal of the highest court of appeal from the House of Lords. The Supreme Court, Blair clearly based this on the American model, was likely to adopt legal activism to a degree dependent on who occupied the bench. And it did just that. So, rather than building a new progressive idea of the nation, as Tony Blair expressly hoped, his reforms have helped to drive a wedge through British society. This project was always an elite-driven dogma, imposed from above on an unsuspecting public, in the belief that they could be forced to see the world through the same enlightened lens as the liberal bourgeoisie. Blair, like other progressives of the time, agreed with the radical German philosopher Jürgen Habermas that identity could be moulded through constitutional change. Habermas falsely equated Europe with America, believing that a collective European identity could be engendered through the creation of a written constitution and a Bill of Rights. But the people turned out to be less compliant than Blair and his allies hoped. This was not just true in the UK, but you'll remember in the rest of Europe too. You'll remember that in 2005, the people of France and the Netherlands rejected the new EU constitution. People in Europe were just not comparable. to the 13 colonies that created the United States. Like England, France is an ancient country. Its identity cannot simply be swept away by the whims of a political elite drunk on half-thought-through visions. Rather than building a new sense of national identity, the New Britain, at the heart of his project, has replaced an inclusive sense of Britishness, an historic source of our nation's strength, with selfish individualism and the narrow exclusive identities promoted by Welsh and Scottish separatists. Now, Tony Blair may be long gone, but his reforms are continued to be regarded as sacrosanct by the Liberal establishment. And the legacy of constitutional reform will continue its inexorable process of destroying the fabric of British society. The Conservatives have failed to dismantle the destructive machinery of Blair's failed constitutional experiment. It is largely the result of timidity, a failure to do what is truly conservative. Most contemporary Conservatives have no idea that there is a distinct Tory tradition of constitutional thought. The academic Alan Beattie described this as the Peelite view. Put simply, the Tory perspective is the Constitution enables the effective use of power to advance the interests of the state. In the Tory view, there are no simple partisan divisions between the state and the people. They are parts of the same body in the way that the Crown and the people are inseparable. Britain as a polity has a distinct communal identity. Power is constrained by tradition and expectation, by political culture, as much as it is by law. Autocracy is not prevented by abstract bills of rights, but on what Yoram Hazmi has described as the bonds of mutual loyalty and the moral sensibilities subscribed to by both those who wield power and those who are subject to it. The Tory view is that government must be able to do the right thing, free from interference in the short run, though subject to post-mortem checks by Parliament and the people. Accountability to Parliament must by definition be after the event, for ministers appointed by the Crown have responsibility for policy. Parliament does not. As little as 30 years ago, this Tory view of the Constitution, enabling a strong and purposeful state, would have been well understood and accepted as legitimate. Yet since the turn of the century, it has been crowded out of the discussion. The two malevolent legal challenges brought by Gina Miller against the process by which the government chose to honour the result of the 2016 referendum and leave the European Union were both founded on such a narrowly defined Whig view of Parliament. The Supreme Court sided with Miller's well-remunerated lawyers in both cases, overturning the judgments of lower courts, demonstrates just how well established this liberal view has become. The judges no doubt genuinely believe they're upholding the role of Parliament, but perhaps inadvertently were compromising the separation of powers by making a quasi-political judgment. What they certainly did not appreciate is they are upholding a contentious view of the role of Parliament, moreover one which is a radical departure from a conservative understanding of the state. Governmental responsibility of Parliament must either mean that ministers take responsibility for their decisions or always respond to short-term parliamentary pressure when making decisions. It cannot logically mean both. That's not to say that government shouldn't be responsive, but only in the interest of good administration, not to ephemeral pressures from those that seek to advance their narrow interests at the expense of society as a whole. Blair's constitutional vandalism has left the British state abject in the face of such pressures. Devolution set in train a centrifugal force that threatens to tear our precious union of nations apart. The incorporation of the ECHR into domestic law has been ruthlessly exploited by those who wish to prevent government from fulfilling its fundamental duties to maintain what is lawful and protect our borders. The law now empowers protesters to prevent law-abiding citizens from getting to work. It prevents the government from deporting those who have entered our country illegally. It has enabled permissive abortion laws to be imposed on Northern Ireland, explicitly against the wishes of the public there. If we are to reverse the malaise that threatens the very fabric of our democracy, as Roger Scruton wrote, quote, "Conservatives must fight boldly and warily, taking a stand at every point where the bond of society lends them support. We must reclaim our constitution from the opportunistic aims of a privileged liberal class that has purposely divorced itself from the nation. We must be unafraid to pursue policies which enjoy popular support, which fuel the common good and elevate the people. That means an education system that doesn't indoctrinate or perpetuate fringe ideas like gender ideology and critical race theory, but instead equips young people with practical skills they need for the workplace. It means a police force that doesn't waste time on pursuing differences of opinion online, but prevents crime and catches delinquents and deviants. It means a justice system that doesn't treat criminals as hapless victims of inequality, but hands out sentences proportionate to the crimes committed, punishing those who hurt the innocent. It means a legal system not enthralled to abstract human rights, where national sovereignty is affirmed, with laws enforced in Britain without edicts from foreign courts. It means a tax system that rewards work, is fair to small businesses, and can't be gamed by corporate multinationals. It means an economic model which eschews short-termism and ends the unfairness which enriches the globalist elite. A fraternal economic order where commerce nourishes the common good and nurtures the national interest. It means a treasury on the side of small British businesses, not predatory multinationals, which are neither rooted in Britain nor have a stake or interest in our shared future. An immigration system driven not by the demands of amoral big business, but in tune with the will of the people, cognizant of the social and cultural pressures that mass immigration brings. It means ending the overwhelming population growth which strains public services and changes beyond recognition the character of our towns and cities. A planning system which genuinely places aesthetics at its heart, which actively seeks to foster community pride and restore the quality of our lives by building beautiful places for generations to come, houses which people delight to own in neighbourhoods they're proud to call home. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for too long, Conservatives have lost the political argument by default. It's not that we've been out-argued, more that we've been afraid to make the people's case, intimidated by arrogant bourgeois liberals and weakened by those who are merely content to appease them. We may be a broad church, but even the most open-minded churchgoer does not want atheists as fellow travellers. So now, the people's instincts must inspire us. The people's interests must drive us. The people's will, our duty to protect our nation, to promote our vision, solely, wholly, and truly conservative. Thank you very much.